Hi, everybody. My name is Jared George. I am a local comic book creator, illustrator. I illustrate children's books, things like that, as well as over 20 comic books. Through the course of the last 10 years, I've gotten in to do classes through the Greene County Library, as well as through different conventions and things like that. I really, really enjoy talking about the things that I have learned over the years. And one of the things that I've really learned is the importance and just the overall rich history of comics that a lot of people seem to overlook unless you're really deep into it. So this is kind of a class. This is going to be a little bullet point type class, but it will be what I've learned thus far about the history of comics and its importance in modern day pop culture, just in culture in general. In fact, it's funny because normally when I teach this class, we're kind of in a slump. So there's not really much need to discuss the fact that comic books are in fact super important in times of need. Look through the past. Anytime there's been a huge event in American culture, especially, comic books have risen to the occasion. So currently, while maybe sales are down on individual books, the heroes, the superheroes, our pantheon of gods that we have has increased in value to us. We are all clinging closer than ever to our Superman, our Batman, our X-Men, our Spider-Mans. We're probably all at home binging our Marvel Cinematic Universe as a way of coping with all the craziness that's happening right now. I'd like to first of all apologize for the state of my studio. It is, in fact, the back shed. My wife let me use as my art studio, so it looks a little janky, but it is where I do all my creating. So bear with that. We'll be good to go. All right, so my tablet's still updating, but I do want to just kind of discuss a few things. When it comes to the first comics in history, this is why I feel like colleges and people in academia don't give it enough credit. Technically speaking, even cave drawings were comic books. They were stories told depicting life, but with pictures. They were real life comic books. When you look at it, you can tell that they were hunting, they were gathering, what they were doing based on the images. Now they were crude, they were rough to look at, but they are, to me, the very first comics. And seeing as that was also the very first time people were able to communicate in a way that wasn't just vocal, that to me indicates that comics are really the first form of communication between people. Look at hieroglyphics. Look, the ancient Egyptians used comics. You can see it in the pictures. Every image had a meaning or purpose behind it. Now you might think, but that was language. It just used pictures for language. But think about this. What's the Superman S do to you? As a nerd, as a geek, as a person in everyday life, you see the Superman symbol, and it inspires hope. It inspires, all these feelings, all these great things. The bat symbol, same thing. You see it and you think of justice, and you think of, so these images have meaning beyond just what they are. The S on Superman's chest isn't just the S that indicates that he's there. It's truth, justice, in the American way, right? So images are powerful. Like what's this phrase? Pictures worth 1,000 words, right? So comic books have been around since the dawn of time. It's just unfortunately looked at as a very crude, non-official form of communication, even though it really is super important. If you need proof of that, how many hundreds of thousands of people every year go to comic book conventions? Are they going to comic book conventions just because? No, they like what they see. And what they see is the art. What they're reading is the words. And when you get those two together and they're melded with a great artist and a great writer, you get some of the greatest stories told in modern times. I think that someday there's a good chance, I mean, maybe not with modern technology being able to show it off this way, but if all this got erased and civilizations in the future were to come see the ancient ruins of America, they might end up in like Metropolis, Illinois, see this giant statue of Superman and assume that that was one of our, ancient gods or something. I don't know for sure, but what I'm getting at is they are our pantheon. They bring so much to us. Now, I'm not going to get too much into to that side of it. So from cave drawings, slowly but surely we get this thing called the printing press. And the printing press allows us to do a lot. Not only are we allowed to produce books, but suddenly we have newspapers available to people. Now, when we get newspapers, people don't just want to see words. People like words and images. So your first comics start. Comics have been around for hundreds of years as far as on the print. Political comics were probably some of the first ones where they depicted, you've seen them. You've seen the Don't Tread on Me. You've seen the old comic books, or the old comic strips. But then from there, it started to become funnies, right? They needed something to break up all that bad news. So what did we get? We got comic strips. And comic strips have been really awesome because while in the recent years they have kind of depleted due to the increase of web comics, and I don't in any way disparage against web comics. They are fantastic. They're a great way of getting around to people. And I recommend any kind of comic really, but because of the rise of web comics and the decrease of people actually purchasing newspaper, our Calvin and Hobbes, our Family Circus, our, weekly Spider-Man shorts, things like that, they're not as important to these companies anymore, but we can still get them online, right? I mean, almost everybody has a website, or you can go and read comics through many different portals for web comics. I sound like I'm dragging this on, and I am, but it's mostly because my notes are still updating. Literally right before this, my notes decided that they needed to, but it's almost there. So let's just continue to go through the brief history, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. After the rise of those comics, suddenly publishers wanted something they could sell to kids. That's right. Just like your grandma thinks, the funny books were not created for us grown people with our overweight beardness. They were actually created to get the kids something to do, essentially. And they were only sold through like supermarkets and places where kids get bored. That is where they sell. So as a parent, I mean, think about it. You go to the grocery store, your kid's bored, they're throwing a fit, you don't want to deal with them. You just want to put something in their hands so they'll leave you alone for 5 seconds. You're going to pick up Superman. You're going to pick up Archie. You're going to pick up, and that is how it started.
Hey, Jared, real quick, I hate to interrupt you, but since you don't have the chat up yet, I just wanted to touch on a few comments right now so they don't get lost in like the thread.
Don't hit me.
Okay, so right now, Doc said a bunch of them real quick. Let me get to them. Doc said, we're often very visual learners.
For sure.
Nate Howard said, I want a statue of Jared George in front of my house.
Well, okay.
And then John Lee Reynolds said, there is some evidence that DC does a really good job of writing gods, where Marvel writes classic hero stories from mythology.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I could teach an entire class on the difference between Marvel and DC. They are.
And then finally, Doc also said, the Swiss artist, and forgive me, Doc, I'll probably mispronounce this name, Rodolphe Topfer is credited with creating the first multi-panel comic in 1827. And the first illustrated book, The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, a decade later.
Yep.
I just wanted to make sure you didn't miss those. All right, I'm sorry. Continue.
You're great. No, thank you guys so much. Yeah, Doc, you were completely right. Pulling up my notes now. Finally updated. Where was I? Yeah, so you get all these innovations, and then, like you said, books were started to being sold through these supermarkets and things like that. And there's a few documentaries on Netflix and things that talk about this particular time period a little bit more. Forgive me, guys. I needed some energy. But what happened was you would rip off the old covers, and you would return the covers back to the publisher for some cash. Now, these stores had boxes and boxes and boxes they're supposed to throw away. So what happened was the clerks or the stock boys would actually take them and start selling them in the back alley for nothing practically. And that was your first comic book shops, right? So from there, it grew and grew and grew till these people were making enough money where they opened up their own shops. And then what I consider modern day comics really started. But kick back a little bit. There was a time when your comics were, you know, like cartoons, but a comic book. So you had your Richie Rich, and you had your, you know, just the old comics that you can find still. And then Superman came about. And Superman is one of the first real modern day comics. Joe Shuster, Jerry Siegel, they created this character that was larger than life, a god amongst men. You know, and his first set of powers, I don't know how many of you guys have ever gone back and read the original Superman. He was just really cool. But he wasn't broken like he is now. Now he is a god. Back then he was just more than man. So let me get into my notes here so we can actually dive into actual thoughts that I've had. There we go. So as of my notes here, and Doc, you might know more than I do on this one, honestly, but the longest running American comic strip is Katzenjammer Kids by Hans and Fritz, created by Rudolf Dirks. It was first published in New York Journal, December 12th, 1897. That is the comic I believe is the one where you actually, the characters grew in the comic, and you could actually see them grow up, get married, have kids of their own, and so on and so forth. The longest running web comic that I could find is Bill Holbrook's Kevin and Kel. It's one of the longest running web comics. It's been running without hiatus since September of 1995, which is baffling to me because I don't think I really understood the internet existed until probably like 98. So this was, you know, I was 10 when this comic started, and it's been going without hiatus since then. At least according since I wrote this. So this is a couple years old. These notes that I have here. The longest running actual print comic book is DC Comics, has been recognized by Guinness World Records as the longest running superhero comic book series. Action Comics, as many of you nerds know, is where Superman got his start before DC. Action Comics is, I mean, it's got the iconic cover, Superman with the car over his head. Comic books are broken down into eras, right? So we have our pre-comic book era, which are going to be your strips, your political cartoons, before it became what we recognize. Pioneer age is 1500s to 1828. So that's a long time ago. And then your Victorian era from 1828 to 1833. The Platinum era, 1883 to 1938. And then the Golden Age, the age that we all actually have, that we have romanticized, is the Golden Age of comics from 1938 to 1949. That is where a bulk of our characters that we still to this day follow were created. There are still new characters coming out, and there are new publishers and things like that that come out. However, this is the time period where you get your Superman, your Batman, Wonder Woman, like all your bigs of the time. And then Silver Age, 1956 to 1970. This is actually the time period where Marvel super kicks off, and you get your Fantastic Fours and your Spider-Man and all of that. The Bronze Age, which is 1970 to about 1980. This is actually a controversial era for comics due to something that happened right towards the, trying to think here, right towards the center of that. when we start getting the comic book code. Um, the comic book code was kind of the government's way of saying, we're done with communism, what's next? I guess we're going to deal with comics now. And so they created these codes of conduct, and some of the rules were absolutely ridiculous. I don't know. I used to have hanging up in here the entire comic book code, and my goal was to make comics that broke every rule in the comic book code. It was things like the bad guy can never win. You can't depict anyone in power as being bad. You can't use the word horror. You can't have werewolves. You can't have vampires. You can't, like, all these things. And that's the era where suddenly comic book companies had to make a decision. Were they going to adhere to these values, or were they going to, essentially they had to become magazines instead of comic books? So like Mad Magazine, later on Heavy Metal Magazine, things like that. These are kind of birthed out of the concept of the comic book code. And you've seen the symbol. It's a little symbol on these 70s and 60s and even 80s comics where it says that it was approved by the comic book code. And that just means that somebody went through it and decided that it does adhere to all these crazy rules that were not necessary for a story. And we've found out since then that some of the best stories that we have in comic book history kind of were what was against it, right? So like your Batman Return, your Return of the Dark Knight, things like that. So during the Golden Age, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster debut in Action Comics #1, published by DC Comics' predecessor, Detective Comics, Inc., in 1938. Marvel Comics' predecessor, Timely Comics, formed in 1939. Following Superman's wildly successful debut, Bob Kane and Bill Finger, which I'm so glad Bill Finger is now getting some credit, created Batman in 1941. So it's interesting to think that in comic books, especially DC Comics, Batman and Superman have this weird friendship, like yin and yang friendship happening, even though Batman was only created because they needed something. The other comic book companies were trying so hard to create something that could match the lightning in a bottle that was Superman. This is all talking about the Golden Age, of course. Harvard-educated psychologist William Moulton Morrison created Wonder Woman in 1941. She was one of the few strong female characters appearing in comic books. She's also become an icon for liberation for women. At the time, however, if you go back and read the original Wonder Woman, you could tell it was made by a psychologist with a little bit of issues. It was a lot, especially if you read it into context as far as... well, I'll let you be the judge. Go back and read old Wonder Woman. I implore you to. Countless superhero tropes, alter ego, origin story, rogues gallery are all forged during this time. So before that, there wasn't a huge thing about the rogues gallery and things like that. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created Captain America in 1941. Now, 1941, the character fought American enemies, included Adolf Hitler, and through World War II. This is the type of thing I was talking about earlier. During times of crisis, if we don't already have a hero, we are prone to creating heroes, prone to creating something that we can look at and hope. So Captain America will always be iconic and will always be tied to World War II, no matter how far removed we are from World War II. Just because he was America as his character, fighting the bad guy and never losing. So Captain America was somebody that we looked up to, and we still do look up to. That's why he's one of everyone's favorite characters in the Marvel Universe, especially the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You can't go wrong with Steve Rogers. He's true. His compass always points north. And even if he wavers, he doesn't waver long. That's probably why when he said Hail Hydra in that one issue, everyone freaked out a bit. Let's see here. As the Golden Age ends, fears of juvenile delinquency led media critics and legislators to scrutinize the roles of comics in America, which brings us into the Silver Age. And this one, DC Comics Showcase #4, published in 1956, reintroduces Golden Age heroes such as the Flash after 5 years of absence, sparking a superhero revival. Other Golden Age characters, including Green Lantern, are revived shortly thereafter. Now, I assume anyone who's watching this is like knows about the original Golden Age Flash and Green Lantern. You know, the Green Lantern who could get beat up by a piece of stick. The Flash who had the gold helmet or the silver helmet with the wings on the side. They were revamped into the types that we have now, which are, the Flash in the red suit with the lightning bolts in his ears, and Green Lantern, who's now space cop, and, things like that. This is a time period where that happened. We were at our first reboots, and because there wasn't the internet, trolls weren't able to complain and whine about the fact that this isn't my Flash. Atlas Comics, a successor of Timely Comics, becomes Marvel Comics in 1961. So 1961 is when we finally get Marvel. Marvel first asserts itself in modern industry force with 1961 publication of Fantastic Four #1, the iconic cover. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's characters proved to be incredibly popular. Jack Kirby. As an artist, I could talk about Jack Kirby for days. As a writer, I can talk about Stan Lee for days. What I can't understand is why Stan Lee has a book called Drawing the Marvel Way. He was not an artist. But Jack Kirby and Stan Lee together forged what could be some of the greatest ideas. Jack Kirby's art by itself could speak for itself. So I assume everyone here knows who those guys are, especially Stan Lee, right? I mean, he just passed not that long ago, rest in peace. But those two guys created Fantastic Four. Oh man, I can't even, I can talk about that for a long time too. Marvel gets into super team craze with the Avengers, first published in 1963. Iron Man and Thor joined in the mid-60s. The team revives Captain America in 1964. The industry group Comic Code Authority, formed in the early 50s, restricts the content of Silver Age books. Published must follow strict content or risk their comics going undistributed. So that was the other side. If they did not adhere to the code at one point, there was a good chance that their comic wouldn't even be seen by the public. And if there's anyone commenting, feel free to pop in again. Unfortunately, I have no way of seeing those comments right now.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, I'll catch you up on what everyone said. Okay, so John Lee Reynolds chimed in with the Wortham Witch Trials, which Deanna chimed in with, yes, Wonder Woman in all caps. Not surprising. And then, and then John Lee Reynolds replied, yeah, Wonder Woman has some interesting origins. And then followed it with, Superman had an interesting time during World War II. I just read a comprehensive history on Supes the other day. He didn't follow the norm for other characters of the same time.
Right. He really, so Marvel and DC take turns being on the forefront. And right now it can be said that because we're now movie-centric, Marvel's on the forefront of the cinematic universe and DC is on the forefront of the animation for comic book content. But there's they always flip-flop. Like, it seems like whenever Marvel's on the top, DC's just behind it. And when DC's on the top, Marvel's just behind it. And Superman had a really weird run. It's almost like DC wanted people to just not think about the war, where Marvel wanted, like, it was everywhere, it was on everyone's mind anyway, so Marvel doubled down on it by making a hero that was all about the war. And it panned out great for both of them, but because of Captain America, we ended up with, this larger-than-life character that to this day we still love. All right, where are we at here? Bronze Age. The Comic Book Authority influence begins to decline as mainstream titles begin to tackle social issues of the day. So this is where you're going to get those comics like the infamous one where Green Arrow's buddy is shooting up heroin and things like that. So this is where we're starting to get into comic books where the code was not thrilled. But comics, are created by creative people, right? And they're read by typically creative people or people who want to be creative. So what's a good way of tackling issues? So we tackled issues through, I mean, old TV shows like Star Trek did a great job of tackling social issues of the day. In the comic book world, we tackled it. That's what we do. That's what comics are about. They're not just about the good side of life. In fact, art is created out of pain a lot of times. And so during a pandemic or an epidemic or issues in our social status, we end up seeing comics reflect that to bring light to it. If anything, comics are a time capsule. We can always tell exactly where the mind of the people were based on the comics that we were reading at the time. So you start to see comics get darker and a little bit more heavy, and a lot of readership falls off from the kids' side. And you start to see more adults reading these comics because they are dealing with stuff that they don't necessarily know how to grasp or comprehend. And so, like, you get your Speedy on heroin, and you get those type of comics. Where was I? Stories grow darker as superheroes face higher stakes. Spider-Man's girlfriend, Gwen Stacy, is killed in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man. Influence of underground comic movement starts to reflect the mainstream comics. So underground comics have always been a thing. If anyone that's watching this is interested at all in getting into self-published comic books, feel free to friend me on Facebook, Jared George. PM me. And we got me, Nate Howard, a bunch of us local guys have contact to some really awesome local printers. But anyway, so your underground comics start to get big. Supernatural themes and horror stories begin to make a comeback. So now you're going to start seeing more vampires and witchcraft and supernatural things happening in the comic books. What it was is for a little bit, the comic book creators were like, okay, we will adhere to your code. But after a while, it's like, look, man, I got ideas. I got stories to tell. And honestly, I need this stuff. You're not telling novels not to write like this. You're not telling TV shows to stop doing this. Why are you making it difficult on comics? And that's because at this point, comics were still looked at as children. It's a children's medium. So, of course, as a parent, I don't want my kid to pick up a book and read about the history of, or, read about something that I'm not necessarily okay with or agree with. But at the same time, as comics became, like, kids had grown up now, and they were still reading their comics just like we do, right? We are all, most of us are grown-ups that are probably watching this right now. We still read our same comics. We still love our comics. We still have an attachment to our comics. So as these kids grew up, they still want to read their comics. And these creators know that. And these creators had a pulse on what people wanted, and they had a pulse on what they wanted to create. So they started to kind of revolt. In Alan Moore's Watchmen limited series featured a deconstruction take of superheroes and debuts a wide critical acclaim. The collected series goes on to not only be a comic featured in Time Magazine's list of best comic books of all time in 2005, but it's a movie. They now have a spin-off TV show. Whether you like all of this or not, and I'll be completely frank with you, I don't love the artwork in The Watchmen, but I love the story. And it's one of the few times where me as a visual person love the story more than the artwork. Typically, I don't stick around too long if I don't like the artwork. But, Alan Moore's Watchmen is iconic. And then you get Frank Miller's work on established superhero titles like Daredevil, Born Again, Batman Year One, The Dark Knight Returns, defined grim and gritty aesthetics for mainstream comics. This is where all of a sudden, Batman is dark. Daredevil, that run of Daredevil is amazing. And it's hard to tell if they were so amazing because they were legitimately amazing or because there's just nothing else like it at the time. It can be said that Dark Knight Returns is one of the greatest Batman stories. There are other really great ones. I'm not trying to talk down on any of these. but it was gritty, it was dark. Batman was in a place that now he's at all the time, but he had not really been at up to that point. Um, it showcased the psyche, what it did to the characters in the Batman universe, and how messed up Gotham had gotten over the years. And so it was a lot different than what people were used to, and that's why it will always be a staple, an important comic book. Again, people or historians or even art colleges will diminish the importance or the love of comics, saying I have a couple of art books from like the 40s and 50s that specifically talk about demerits the legitimacy of comic books and comic book art as a form of creation and art. But I mean, time and time again, comics have proven to be the most important. Um, as the end of this era comes down, 1985's Crisis on Infinite Earths mainstreams resets DC's continuity, which is something we're going to see so many more times, a reset in continuity for DC. And it gets irritating as a fan, but it happens again and again. Comic begins a wide acceptance as a legitimate art form now. So it's finally credited. Now, most of us are young enough to not remember the time period where comics weren't part of the mainstream. I am 34, I turned 35 this year. I remember the huge shift around the time that, you know, like the first Blade movie had come out, where suddenly nerd culture started to become super mainstream. Hot Topic was selling nerd stuff. GameStop was selling nerd apparel. Suddenly, preppy girls were dressing with Zelda bracelets. And the landscape changed a lot, where I went from, oh, you read those comic books, to, hey, man, who's your favorite Green Lantern? Like, from people who I'd never talked about comics. And then, of course, I got to be a hipster, which, of course, I was okay with. Then we get into the modern times. The grim and gritty realism continues with the trend in superhero comics. Colleges and universities widely begin offering courses in sequential art. There are a few colleges out there that offer an amazing courses in comic book art and sequential art, and how to make your own books, and how to become essentially a comic book artist. And I'm not meaning like Jack Kirby's art school, which I sure still exists and is probably awesome, but I'm talking about a major university offering a degree in something that you could literally learn all by yourself if you just sit down and think about it. But now it's finally becoming important to everyday life. Colleges, society as a whole has finally started to realize, sorry if you hear the mowing, started to realize that comics are an important part of everyday life. The media consolidates, reaches publish, or the media consolidation starts to reach as DC Comics is purchased by Warner Brothers and Marvel by Disney. So there was a time period where it would have just blown everyone's mind if we thought that you know, Warner Brothers was going to own DC. But the weirdest one is going to be just all the things that Disney has been picking up. Disney owns pretty much all of our nerd hearts. We can't escape Disney now if we want to watch anything that's not DC. Just look on Disney Plus. It's just nothing but nerd, and Disney princesses, and even that's part of the nerddom now. So it's weird to think that everything is being bought up, and we got these big hubs that now control all of our nerddom. The cool thing that comes out of it is the Marvel movies. The cool things that come out of it are the Warner Brothers money going towards really awesome animation for some really amazing cartoons and things like that. The downside is they are now controlled by an even larger entity. So they're not going to have as much wiggle room. And because of that, also, corporate greed means that the prices are going to continue to go up on our books. And because of that, many of us have backed out of buying individual copies, waiting for Amazon to have it as a bulk set, or we try to hit a local comic book shop, but those are becoming endangered species these days, especially ones that put out new issues every week. Here in the Springfield area, we've lost some really, really great comic book shops over the last years, just due to the changing climate. And it's been a increasing issue since the mid 90s for comic book shops. But it's finally hit kind of a pinnacle critical mass for a lot of them. And so if you can have a local comic book shop in your area, even if they don't sell new stuff, I implore you, go check them out, buy some issues, tell them what you're looking for, see if they can find them for you. Another comic shop on Kearney Street's a good one, Nameless City here in Springfield. These places really, really, really could use your help. Freedom Comics in Lebanon is another one. Finest Macy up there. He's a great guy. So hit these places up, especially right now with COVID happening. Call them, ask them what they have, and see if they'll do curbside for you. It's not a PSA. It's just something that's near and dear to my heart. It breaks my heart every time a new comic shop shuts down, only because without them, independent comic book creators like myself, Nate Howard, Adam McLaughlin, we have no place to sell our books through anymore, and we have to do it solely on our own, which we can do, but there's something that makes you feel so great having your own book on the shelf. Sorry about that. Did not mean for that to go there. All right. So as we continue, in a bid to win new readers in 2011, DC Comics resets DC's universe and restarts all titles starting at number 1. This includes long-running titles such as Action Comics at the time. The title in which Superman debuted in 1938 was at issue number 904. So issue 904, and then they reset to number 1. Now, my favorite story about that entire reboot was the Batman team getting together like, hey guys, we're going to reboot, but we're going to do a soft reboot, right? And everyone was like, yes. Everyone else started, and all your comic book heroes were almost unrecognizable except for Batman. And you had Greg Capullo, and you had Snyder, and that's probably my favorite modern run of comics, like the Court of Owls, things like that, which is Court of Owls was so good that I legitimately had to go back through old Batman comics to make sure that this had not actually been a thing since the dawn of Batman. It made me convinced that I had missed this huge thing for years. But unfortunately, it was just part of that story, but it was really good. All right, so now let's talk about indie comics. Indie comics have been around since, we were able to go to Kinko's and make copies. Many independent comic book creators have flourished. Later on became actual named, big historically named comic books. Jeff Smith, Bone, was an independent comic book before it got picked up. In fact, it's my favorite indie comic. If you have kids or if you're looking for a great story, definitely look into that. I have no idea where I am on time. All right, I got a little bit. So, and then you get into political comics, mini comics, graphic novels. So we have many forms of this. Graphic novel is two different things. There are sequential books. Those are books that have multiple issues in one. It's a volume. Then you have graphic novels, like Mouths, which is an entire story specifically designed to be read like a novel, as a book. Now, comic books have done a great job at keeping their runs at 12 issues, and if you read it, it reads like a novel. But the difference is one's a volume from a comic book series, and the other one is a book designed specifically for you to read as a comic. Now, I'll never cut hairs with someone who says that, this run of Batman is their favorite graphic novel. But I will say that there is a distinct difference between the two. One has never been seen in individual issues and is only released as one set that you're supposed to read as a novel. The other one is a grouping of individual issues that make up a volume. Now, again, not a big deal. Just I feel like I needed to differentiate between the two. Some of the comic book code things that I loved, one was crime shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust in forces of law and justice, or to inspire others to desire and to imitate criminals. So you couldn't feel bad for the Joker. You couldn't understand Magneto's plight and what he was after. You couldn't want to hate Wolverine. Like these things that we later have grown to appreciate in comics were against the rules, right? Heroes were heroes, bad guys were bad guys. No gray area. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way to create disrespect or for established authority. In today's political climate, could you imagine trying to adhere by that? On both sides. I'm not trying to be political at all. Just think about it. If you were not allowed to disparage or talk bad about the government, police officers, firemen, any of that, right? You couldn't have a crooked cop. You couldn't have a politician who's on the take from the bad guys. Another one is in every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and criminal punished for his misdeeds. Criminal can never get away. Crime always pays. The good guy's always on top. He never fails. Like, this is so boring. But this is what they wanted. They wanted you to know. Because this was for kids. So kids were supposed to think that good always wins. Let's see here. General standards, part B, was no comic book magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. And scenes dealing with or instruments associated with The Walking Dead, torture, vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, or werewolfism are prohibited. Now think about what's one of the greatest, or not greatest, one of the biggest comics in the last 10 years. The Walking Dead is literally a giant breaking of this rule. It's about The Walking Dead. It even specifically talks about associated with Walking Dead. So that's kind of funny to me. I like to pretend like they named it The Walking Dead as kind of a to the rules, but again, by the time that came out, the rules weren't even in effect anymore. Ridicule or attack on any religious or racial group will never be permissible. Now, that might be a rule that I can get behind still, but it's a weird rule to have in here. And on costumes, suggestive and salacious illustrations or suggestive posture is unacceptable. Now, I find it weird that the costume rules are more or less specifically geared towards female characters. I mean, because you wouldn't worry about Captain America being, standing there in a suggestive way. However, Black Cat, not Black Cat, sorry about that, Catwoman, things like that. In the past, there have been some covers. Spider-Woman is one of them, where the internet was in an uproar about the way she was posed. My biggest beef with it was really just the legitimization of how she was working that body. But so suggestive and salacious. And then, of course, characters shall be depicted in dress reasonably acceptable to society. So scantily clad, right? Because you weren't too worried about dudes again. This was specifically geared towards the women in comics, which irritates the snot out of me. If you're going to make a rule, it should be something that can be a clear depiction across the board. Females shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities. Note, it should be recognized that all proportions dealing with costume, dialogue, or artwork applies as specifically to the cover of a comic magazine as they do the contents. So your cover couldn't be over the top. Your interiors couldn't be over the top. Power Girl could not exist. Fun story behind Power Girl. But anyway, so this is just, and then divorce shall not be treated humorously or represented as desirable. So you weren't supposed to say, hey guys, go get a divorce. Or these two are now happy because they're not together. Or anything that made it seem like divorce was a good option. And then finally, treatment of live romance stories shall emphasize the value of home and the sanctity of marriage. So no premarital things, no running around behind your husband's back, things like that. Is there any questions, comments? Did I say something that's completely wrong? I'd like to open it up a little bit here.
Well, no, I highly doubt you said anything wrong, Jared. But I will say there are a few comments. Give me just 1 sec to catch up on all of them.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a little funny. So give me 1 sec. Okay, so another comic shop tuned in about the time that you actually mentioned them. And John Lee Reynolds said, were your ears burning? Because he was just mentioning you all. And
well,
then,
I love the guys over at another comic shop. They're good people.
Yeah. And then backing on that, one of our Visioncon representatives said that we wholeheartedly agree and that we should all support our local comic book shops and tell them to join us for future Visioncons in person so we can even spread the word even further.
Sure.
John Lee Reynolds then chimed in with, our binge consumption society means graphic novels are on the way in, and unfortunately, I'm worried it will make the floppies obsolete.
Yeah, that's something that we have to worry about for sure. Well, I mean, it doesn't help that the price tag's like $6-7 a pop anymore for half these books. So, I mean, that doesn't help either. But yeah, with our binge society, we definitely would rather read 32 comics in one go than wait 32 weeks.
Another comic book shop also chimed in and said, don't say Power Girl while John is here. I'm assuming there's a story behind that, but
yeah, Power Girl there's a whole thing behind Power Girl.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're running a little short because you have another panel starting at 11.
Yeah, I do. So if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, you can always PM me on my personal Facebook page, Jared George. Also on Instagram at 6footgnome. And just hit me up if you have any questions concerning history, just want to chat comics, or if you're interested in getting into comics, I'll be more than happy to share my knowledge with you.
All right. Well, that was Jared George. Thank you so much for giving us a brief history of comics. I'm going to hit stop record right now.